U.S. President Donald Trump says he will now impose a 50% tariff on copper imports.
And now, today we're doing copper. I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
We're still facing and intensifying unjustified tariffs from our largest trading partner. And the best way to respond to that is to respond at home.
I think you're going to see shipments from Canada to the United States completely stop.
And other things into the country, they're going to be tariffed at a very, very high rate, like 200%.
It's all about marketing for him. He is the master of repackaging the status quo as a victory.
My message to you is Canada is not for sale. We're open for business. We have cutting edge infrastructure. We have strong financial support, and we're open for science. And we also invest in excellence.
It started with a single announcement in Washington, but within hours, the shockwaves were felt in every corner of the American economy. President Donald Trump sat at the head of a long mahogany table in the cabinet room and declared in his usual combative tone, "We did steel, as you know, they're 50%. We did aluminum 50%. Lumber just came out. Now today we're doing copper. I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%. So words fell like a hammer. It wasn't just another trade move. It was the ignition of a new economic battle, one that would backfire almost instantly. Less than 24 hours after the ink dried on Trump's tariff order, the U.S. had already lost an estimated $4.2 billion in trade value. Copper prices on the COMEX exchange exploded, surging 13% overnight to an unprecedented $5.95 per pound. In trading rooms from New York to Chicago, brokers watched their screens with disbelief. This wasn't a gradual market shift, it was a vertical spike, the kind you only see when something in the global supply chain snaps. And that's exactly what had happened. Because the moment Trump weaponized copper tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, Canada, America's single largest source of refined copper, retaliated, not with speeches, not with half measures, but with a direct and devastating strike. Ottawa froze every existing export contract. Mining giants like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals stopped shipping to the United States overnight.
We will not rely on a partner that unilaterally changes the rules of the game.
The consequences were immediate and brutal. The U.S., which imports more than 40% of its refined copper from Canada, was thrown into a supply crisis not seen since wartime. Copper is the silent workhorse of modern life, woven into every electric vehicle motor, every home wiring system, every circuit board, every power grid connection. Suddenly, this critical metal became the focal point of a trade war. Trump had justified the tariff as a national security measure, branding copper as a strategic material America could not afford to outsource. But the reality was grim. The U.S. produces just over half of the copper it needs, and refining capacity is woefully insufficient. In the global metals market, those higher prices created chaos. On the London Metal Exchange, copper prices actually dipped slightly, reflecting the expectation of reduced U.S. demand. But in America, the exact opposite happened. Prices exploded upward, creating a staggering 25% gap between U.S. and international copper prices. Canada, meanwhile, wasn't just cutting off supply in anger. It was executing a calculated strategic pivot. For decades, over half of Canada's copper exports went straight to the U.S. Now, those shipments were being redirected to Asia and Europe. For American manufacturers, the blow was immediate. The automotive sector was hit first. Electric vehicle makers like Tesla and Ford, already under pressure from tight profit margins, saw their copper costs soar by tens of millions per month. The construction industry too felt the squeeze. Copper wiring, plumbing components, and power systems became significantly more expensive for large infrastructure projects. These weren't small adjustments. They were budget-busting increases that could kill projects before they even broke ground. When the dust from that first chaotic week began to settle, the true scale of the crisis came into focus, and it was far worse than even the sharpest market analysts had predicted. In boardrooms across Detroit, Silicon Valley, and Houston, executives pored over supply forecasts. Canada's decision to freeze copper exports wasn't just a defensive move. It was an offensive maneuver executed with precision. Within days of halting shipments to the U.S., Canadian firms secured long-term contracts with buyers in Japan and South Korea. And by investing $188 billion in new port facilities, rail expansions, and refining partnerships abroad, Ottawa was making sure those new channels would carry copper away from U.S. shores for decades. Meanwhile, the American domestic market was unraveling. In the energy sector, utilities scrambled to secure copper-based conductors for power grid upgrades. The sudden cost surge of 22–25% on these materials forced companies to choose between delaying projects or passing the costs directly to consumers. The electronics industry faced a different kind of nightmare. From smartphones to solar panels, copper is the hidden lifeline of modern technology. Without it, production schedules faltered. In towns across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, smaller manufacturers, many of them producing electrical wiring, motors, or specialized copper-based components, were teetering on the brink. But here's where the crisis took an even more dangerous turn. Copper stockpiles in the U.S. were dwindling fast. While some companies had built up inventory in anticipation of trade turbulence, those reserves were finite. Analysts from UBS warned that at once the buffer ran dry, projected to happen within 2 to 3 months. Prices would spike even further. Globally, the ripple effects were already visible. The London Metal Exchange tracked unusual patterns in copper futures trading as investors bet on long-term U.S. price instability. In Asia, smelters in China and Japan expanded their operations to process more Canadian raw copper. Inside the White House, the narrative remained defiant. Officials framed the tariffs as a necessary stand against unfair trade practices, insisting that short-term pain would lead to long-term gains. Yet, behind closed doors, lobbyists from the automotive, construction, and energy sectors flooded congressional offices with urgent pleas to intervene. The message was blunt. Without immediate policy changes, America risked a manufacturing slowdown so severe it could shave 0.5 percentage point off GDP growth this quarter alone. The human cost was also beginning to surface. Rising copper costs filtered into the everyday economy in ways most Americans didn't see directly yet. The wiring for a new home, the repair of a transformer after a storm, the replacement of industrial motors in a factory, each was suddenly far more expensive. And while those costs were initially absorbed by companies, the breaking point was approaching. Soon they would show up in higher utility bills, steeper car payments, and inflated prices for electronics. In the midst of it all, one question loomed over America's economic future. Had the administration underestimated not just Canada's resolve, but the interconnected nature of the 21st century? Because this was no longer just a trade dispute over a single commodity. It was a reshaping of alliances, a rerouting of markets, and a warning shot that even America's most reliable partners would not hesitate to walk away when treated as adversaries. By the third week of the copper standoff, it was clear the crisis was no longer confined to boardrooms and trade statistics. It was bleeding into the political arena. Congressional hearings became battlegrounds where furious lawmakers grilled administration officials over the decision's fallout. Governors from manufacturing-heavy states sent urgent letters to the White House warning that plant closures and layoffs were imminent. Behind the official statements of confidence, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of panic. The numbers were grim. UBS projected a 0.5% GDP contraction in the current quarter due solely to supply chain disruptions in copper-intensive industries. The figure may have seemed small on paper, but in an economy as vast as America's, that translated into tens of billions in lost output. The construction industry, already dealing with labor shortages and high interest rates, saw costs for electrical systems rise by double digits. New housing projects were being shelved, not for lack of demand, but because developers could no longer make the budgets work with copper wiring prices so inflated. For the auto industry, the situation had crossed from inconvenient to dangerous. Major automakers, including GM and Ford, began quietly postponing electric vehicle launches, calculating that selling at the new price point would crush demand. Tesla, which relies heavily on vertically integrated supply lines, was still taking losses. Reports estimated millions lost each month due to higher copper costs alone. And for smaller EV startups, the crisis was existential. Without the scale to absorb the cost hikes, they faced the grim choice of raising prices far beyond market tolerance or shutting down entirely. Telecommunications, a sector often overlooked in trade disputes, was also in trouble. Copper is essential for building and maintaining broadband networks and 5G infrastructure. Carriers were forced to delay rural network expansion projects, particularly in underserved regions where federal subsidies barely covered normal costs. Let alone the inflated prices caused by the tariff war. For millions of Americans still lacking reliable high-speed internet, the promise of bridging the digital divide was being quietly pushed back indefinitely. Canada's new alliances were solidifying by the day. Shipments of raw copper that once moved south to U.S. ports now flowed east across the Pacific. Japan's Sumitomo Corporation and South Korea's LS Cable and Systems secured multi-year supply contracts with Canadian miners, locking in steady access to high-quality copper at prices well below the inflated U.S. market. China, never slow to seize a strategic opening, increased its imports of Canadian copper concentrate, processing it in domestic smelters, and then exporting refined copper to other markets, effectively stepping into the role the U.S. had forfeited. For Canada, the long-term gains were as significant as America's losses. By reducing dependence on a single market, Ottawa was insulating its economy from future unilateral shocks. And with billions in infrastructure investments underway, Canada was positioning itself not just as a supplier, but as a central hub in the global copper supply chain. This was not retaliation born of anger. It was strategy born of opportunity. Inside the U.S., the political rhetoric was heating up. Trump continued to frame the tariff as a fight for American independence from foreign suppliers, insisting that domestic production would eventually rise to meet demand. But industry experts called this a fantasy. Building new copper mines and refining facilities in the U.S. could take a decade or more given environmental regulations, permitting hurdles and the sheer capital required. By the time any meaningful domestic capacity came online, the damage to America's industrial position could be permanent. The cracks in the administration's narrative widened as more economic data came in. Retail prices for appliances from refrigerators to air conditioners were inching upward as manufacturers passed along higher copper costs. Home builders warned that the average cost of a new home could jump by $17,000 to $22,000 due to price spikes in wiring and other copper components. And in the renewable energy sector, wind and solar projects faced material cost overruns that threatened to derail the country's clean energy targets. Here's where the story took on an even more profound dimension. The global perception of U.S. reliability as a trade partner was shifting. Allies who once saw America as the anchor of stable trade policy were now openly discussing contingency plans to reduce dependence on U.S. markets. In Brussels, EU trade officials cited the copper tariffs as a case study in policy unpredictability, warning that even allied nations needed to safeguard themselves against sudden American policy swings. The political blowback at home was also growing sharper in manufacturing states. Voters who had once cheered Trump's trade toughness were now facing layoffs, canceled contracts, and rising costs for everyday goods. Local news outlets ran stories of electricians and construction crews forced to delay work because they couldn't source affordable copper wiring. In the industrial Midwest, the narrative of economic nationalism was colliding with the reality of economic contraction, and yet the administration pressed on, portraying the tariff as a long-term play for self-reliance. But outside the White House bubble, the reality was impossible to ignore. The U.S. had picked a fight it could not win quickly against a partner that held more leverage than it ever admitted. Canada hadn't just cut off copper, it had redrawn the map of the global supply chain. The deeper question now wasn't simply how long the U.S. could endure these shortages and price spikes. It was whether America's industrial position, painstakingly built over decades, could ever be restored to what it was before this ego-driven trade war began. Because every day the tariff remained in place, another contract was signed in Tokyo, Seoul, or Shanghai, and another piece of the copper supply puzzle slipped permanently out of America's hands. By the second month of the copper war, the U.S. economy was beginning to feel the kind of deep systemic strain that no press conference could spin away. The early weeks of confusion had given way to something more dangerous, a grinding everyday reality of higher costs, delayed projects, and a creeping sense among businesses that this crisis wasn't going away anytime soon. In factories from Ohio to Texas, the message from management to workers was the same. We're cutting hours not because we want to, but because the materials just aren't here. In the automotive heartlands, assembly lines stood still for days at a time. Parts shortages rippled through supply chains that once ran with military precision. For the first time in years, auto plants in Michigan reported significant production slowdowns that had nothing to do with labor strikes or consumer demand. It was copper, or the lack of it, that was choking output. The electric vehicle revolution that Washington claimed to champion was now limping, hobbled by the cost of its most essential raw material. In the construction sector, developers were ripping up budgets and rewriting project timelines. Affordable housing initiatives stalled as copper wiring costs surged past the point of feasibility. For families hoping to move into new homes, the delays weren't measured in weeks anymore. They were in months, sometimes years. The same story echoed across public works. City planners postponed grid modernization projects, school renovations, and infrastructure upgrades, not because they lacked will or funding, but because a single metal had become prohibitively expensive. The political fallout was accelerating. Governors in swing states, including those who had supported Trump in the past, began to distance themselves from the tariff policy. They warned that the combination of rising consumer prices and industrial stagnation could trigger a recession in regions that had only recently recovered from the last economic downturn. Town halls turned tense as residents confronted elected officials asking why their electricity bills were climbing, why their cars cost more, and why their communities were losing contracts to foreign competitors. In Canada, they were thriving. The once junior partner in North America's metals trade was now being courted by the world's largest economies. Canadian copper, once shipped in bulk to U.S. smelters, was now refined in Asia and sold into markets from Europe to the Middle East. Ottawa's $1.88 billion investment in new export infrastructure was already paying dividends, with port expansions and rail links pushing record volumes to overseas buyers. Canadian mining companies posted profit surges, their stock prices buoyed by the sudden diversification of their customer base. Globally, the United States found itself in an unfamiliar position, isolated in a market it once dominated by pricing itself out through tariffs and losing its primary supplier. America had effectively handed over leverage to rivals. China's state-run industries in particular wasted no time exploiting the gap. They didn't just buy Canadian copper, they locked in contracts for decades, securing a level of stability that American manufacturers could now only envy. In Washington, Trump doubled down. The rhetoric was fiery. Promises that America would emerge stronger, that the tariffs were a short-term sacrifice for long-term independence. But behind closed doors, advisors admitted the obvious copper mining and refining capacity in the U.S. was nowhere near ready to meet domestic demand. The permitting process alone for a new mine could take 7 to 10 years, even if environmental opposition was ignored. The infrastructure to refine that copper at scale practically non-existent. Meanwhile, the social consequences were taking shape. Rising costs filtered into everyday life. The electrician charging more for a simple repair, the higher price tag on a washing machine, the surging expense of a new HVAC installation. These weren't luxury items. They were the essentials of modern living. For millions of Americans, it meant tightening household budgets and delaying major purchases, feeding a cycle of reduced consumer spending that risked slowing the broader economy. The irony was impossible to miss. A policy sold as a path to American strength had weakened the very industries it was supposed to protect. The $4.2 billion in lost trade from Canada's export freeze was only the opening blow. By some estimates, the ripple effect in lost contracts, delayed projects, and inflated costs could climb into the tens of billions before the year was out. And then came the reputational cost. In diplomatic circles, allies began questioning whether the U.S. could still be trusted to honor long-standing trade relationships. The copper war had made one thing clear to every global supplier. America was willing to upend entire industries overnight for the sake of political theater. That knowledge alone would make future negotiations harder, more cautious, and less favorable to U.S. interests. As the crisis deepened, one reality became inescapable. This wasn't simply a battle over copper. It was a test of economic leadership. And by every measurable metric, the U.S. was losing. Canada had turned a retaliatory move into a strategic victory, reshaping its trade networks to ensure long-term resilience. America had turned a confident tariff announcement into a self-inflicted wound, one that might take years, if not decades, to heal. The question now is whether the damage can be reversed. Can the United States rebuild trust with its trading partners, restore stability to its supply chains, and adapt to a global market that is increasingly moving on without it? Or will this moment be remembered as the point when America's industrial influence began to shrink, not because it was outcompeted, but because it chose to sideline itself? One thing is certain, the price of copper is no longer just about metal. It's about strategy, credibility, and the cost of letting ego dictate economic policy. And as Americans open their utility bills, buy their next car, or plan their next home, they'll feel the weight of that cost every single time. So I'll leave you with this. In a world where trade relationships are as valuable as the commodities themselves, what does it mean when a nation pushes its closest partner away? And more importantly, what happens when the world learns to live without you?